Thanks for tuning in to TellyCast. Before this week's show, I wanted to tell you about our exciting new event, the TellyCast Content Funding Festival. Taking place at the Ashworth Centre, Lincoln's Inn in London, on Tuesday, April 26th, the TellyCast Content Funding Festival has been created to bring producers and financiers together to explore the wide range of production funding options available today. The full-day event features panels with industry leaders exploring the new finance models, sponsored by Pipe, blockchain and NFTs, sponsored by M Content, co-production Evolved, sponsored by Quintus Studios, and brand-funded programming 2.0, sponsored by Apex Content Ventures. Delegates will be able to schedule face-to-face meetings at the event with our sponsors, who are actively looking to partner with producers. And there's also lots of opportunities to meet with other attending financiers in regular networking breaks throughout the day, sponsored by Drive. Plus, each delegate will receive an exclusive detailed report packed with tips, advice and insight on today's content funding models, courtesy of event partners and industry intelligence experts K7 Media. Tickets are on sale now, starting at just $169.99 for producers and $199.99 for financiers. And for a limited time, TellyCast listeners can get an extra £20 off the ticket price by entering TellyCast Plus. That's TellyCast in capital letters and the plus symbol at checkout. But hurry, tickets are limited and they're available on tellycast.com/events. We hope to see you there.
TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Before we kick off this week's show, I wanted to thank everyone who came along to the first TellyCast Content Funding Festival. We've had some fantastic feedback, so thanks to all of our delegates, our panellists, our sponsors, Pipe, Apex Content Ventures, Drive, M Content and Quintus Studios. And also thanks to our partners, Pact, K7 Media, The Bridge, TBI Broadcast and Edinburgh TV Festival. Over the next few weeks, we'll be replaying some of the panels, giving you an insight into the conversations that were had by our industry leaders. On this week's show, we're replaying the brand-funded Programming 2.0 panel that kicked off proceedings. Our expert panel featured consultant and former controller of branded entertainment at Channel 4, Simon Wells, ITV's Director of Digital and Creative Partnerships, Bhavit Chandrani, Head of Content at Apex Content Ventures, Katie West, Paul Tremain, EVP and Managing Director of EMEA at United Entertainment Group, and it was moderated by K7 Media's Clare Thompson. The panel was recorded on Tuesday, 26th of April at Lincoln's Inn in London, and the panel was sponsored by Apex Content Ventures. I hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I would like to introduce, first of all, Bhavit Chandrani. So Bhavit heads up sponsorship, ad-funded programming, creative partnerships and digital partnership strategy at ITV. Next to him, we have Katie West. So Katie is head of Apex Content Ventures UK, part of Publicis Media. She manages Apex's investment into UK production. And prior to Apex, she was at Sky TV for 16 years, where she set up new revenue streams for branded content and channel sponsorships. Next to her, we have Simon Wells. Simon was previously controller of funded content at Channel 4 for 7 years. Before that, head of formats and IP at specialist content agency Drum OMG for 9 years. Simon's early career was in TV ad production before a stint at Basel TV, where he worked on a number of early AFPs in the early 2000s. He's now a consultant specialising in branded entertainment, working for clients, agencies and producers to help broker new types of commercial funding arrangements. And then last, we have Paul Tremain. Paul recently joined UEG as Managing Director, EMEA, from Mediacom, where he was Managing Partner for Content and responsible for the leadership of branded entertainment, influencer marketing, social and content partnerships. During that time, he worked with some of the biggest brands to devise and deliver shows like Extreme Everest with Ant Middleton, in association with Barocca, Women's World Football in association with Coca-Cola, Tour de Celeb with Skoda, and the return of changing rooms in association with Dulux. So thank you everybody for joining us. And I think the first thing to say is, as I mentioned before, we're doing this panel and I've been doing various telecasts and reports about this subject because there is an awful lot of it about. The first thing I think, though, to just sort of clarify is some of the terms that we're talking about and some of the different models of how brands are currently funding content, because it can work in a few different ways. So, Katie, I was going to ask if you could give us a little snapshot of what you do at Apex and what those models are.
Well, I can explain a little bit about program finance or content finance, as some people have probably heard of it described before. As Claire's mentioned, I work for Apex Content Ventures. It's a separate trading entity, but it's part of the Publicis Group. So just to sort of explain a bit about what Publicis Group is. Publicis Group is a global set of agencies in the advertising space. They represent massive clients across the globe, and they do both their creative work. So you might have heard of Saatchi's or Leo Burnett's. They're creating the TV ads or the space, but they also do the deployment of the media. So they'll be buying ad space throughout the different spaces. So they do that work, and all of the work the agency does is advertising, advice really about how to spend their money for best practice. What we do in Apex Content Ventures is slightly different because we work on behalf of the group and we invest money from our head office, which is in Paris. And rather than using the client's money, we use our own company's money and we invest that via commercial broadcasters into TV programming. We do that because we really want to support the ad space. So we want to make sure that we're continuing to allow our commercial broadcasters to have the best programming they possibly can, because when they have the best programming, they draw the best audiences, and that enables the advertising space to be, we can continue to have advertising space. It works really well for the broadcasters themselves because the advantage to them is that we are making investments really early on in their financial year, and significant investments. And what that means is that the broadcasters are able to make decisions about where they want to spend that money without having to wait for the advertisers to fluctuate, because as we had a year in pandemic, the spend can completely drop off. Whereas when we're using Apex Content Ventures, we're making that investment early without any strings attached, so they can depend on that investment. In terms of how we work with producers, as many of you I know the audience is today, it's very light touch really. Once we've made a decision about what programs are going to be invested in, which is always the broadcaster's decision, we will then have a conversation with those producers. We explain how we work. We'd like to get to have conversations and relationships with you guys. And then we have a credit on the program at the end, which will say, just with thanks to Apex. And the other thing just to know is that we don't take any rights when we're working with producers. So that's our model. That's program finance, content finance.
Yeah. And so in the report, we lay out for people coming to this kind of a bit freshly those differences between program finance versus brand-funded programming. And also it is difficult because all the different agencies do have slightly different models. Some take rights, some don't, and it can be kind of quite confusing. So we talk a bit about the different players in the market and how that works. But just more broadly then, so it feels like people have obviously been talking about AFP, BFP, brand-funded programming, M-funded programming for a long time, but do we feel like something has significantly shifted? I mean, Simon, at Channel 4, you oversaw a sort of flourishing period of this at Channel 4, and then since you've left, you've been looking at other kind of players in the market and what's happening more widely. Do you feel we're at a kind of sea change?
Well, brand-funded programming, or branded entertainment, as we call it at Channel 4, and I like to call it because it is entertainment first. The difference between that and program finance is that the brand or the advertiser, the client specifically, generally one client, is using it as a marketing asset. They're using it to replace or to support their advertising and marketing of their brand or their products. And so therefore it's something that they need to involve themselves very closely in. It has been tricky, let's be honest, but it started, as you said rightly, it was a bedrock of American television in the 50s. And then as the sort of industry matured and advertising and spot advertising became kind of like the way the world worked, it went away, and it only really returned to the UK in about 92, 93, when sponsorship was allowed, and then sponsorship, some of it morphed into things like the Pepsi Chart Show, and you probably all remember the Pepsi Chart Show. Basically what's happened since the Pepsi Chart Show is a sort of big burst in it of things like music shows and cookery and chop and chat shows and sports shows funded by brands across most of the channels. But in the last six or 8 years, the quality of it's got better. The brands and the agencies, a few agencies have got really supportive of it, like Mediacom and other agencies have seen its effectiveness. Channels like Channel 4 have embraced it more. The commissioning editors are beginning to understand it better, and the quality has improved, basically. And it's moved out of those sort of easy wins like music and sport into entertainment shows. And when I worked at Basil, I think one of the most interesting things, Pete Bazalgette, I worked with Emma Derrick, who's here today. One of the biggest shows they did was Changing Rooms. And at the time, Baz said, wouldn't it be great if we could just get, Dulux to kind of get on?
Did they actually say Dulux? Right.
The show goes out. Dulux ring me up and say, what colours are you showing this week? Because we need to stock up at all the DIY stores. And please give us a run on it. And he would supply them with details of what colours were going to be used. And he said, wouldn't it be brilliant if they could get involved and fund the show? And of course, 20 years
Only
later,
took 20 years.
they have. So it shows that actually what is most important is creativity, a good television idea. And I know Bab will come on to the television side, the broadcaster side. And I think, in a way, at Channel 4, perhaps we pushed it a bit too far on some projects, I'll be honest. But, actually, ultimately, what this is about, making brilliant television and getting a brand partner as a co-pro partner. That's what I'd say it is.
Yeah.
And so I think that what's happened is over the last few years, the quality's got better, the genres have broadened out, and people are beginning to understand it. And I see healthy growth for it.
And do you think, Paul, that brands are seeing it differently? I mean, it's obviously it has to be driven as much from their side, but are they becoming more savvy about what they can and can't do and what the benefits are?
Part of the reason why you see so many of these up here is that the risk has been reduced, it's been removed. I mean, if you go back 8-9 years, social media barely existed. The ability to activate these things barely existed. So now, just building on Simon's point, you have to come at it from the brand's perspective. If they kind of view this as a shop window to a marketing exercise. And I think as a producer, if you get your head around and get yourself into that mindset, it's a really good place to be. The Changing Rooms example is a perfect exponent of that, where it touched 13 media channels. So that shows how smart the client was. So yes, producers are getting better at making them and understanding the nuances. Broadcasters are getting better at them as well, but brands are understanding them more because there are more examples. And they're high-profile examples. Supermarket Sweep's another one. Changing Rooms, the Everest climb that we did, the show Bab's done with Marks and Spencer's. Is it called Cooking with the Stars, Bab? Yeah, I don't watch ITV. So you've got all these brilliant examples that are high profile. And I think, again, the thing to understand is that as producers, you're fighting for budget that could be spent elsewhere. But when you think about some of the effectiveness stories that are coming out, it's easier to now make that play. When we put Changing Rooms on air, their search volumes went through the roof on the particular paints and the particular range that they were showing in the show. They used assets that were supported by paid media, so it supported that whole line in their media budget. They were able to fuel their own social channels. They were able to take it in store and create dominant positions, end of aisle. So it gave them a marketing vehicle. And I think, probably the first one that turned the tide for us when I was at Mediacom was the Barocca one, in terms of Extreme Everest, because it was extreme entertainment. And then I think what you get then is you get a lot of colleagues around a media agency or an agency building sit up and think, there's a new route to an audience. And that is actually what this is about. It's about partnering a brand where the audience wants to spend time, where they choose to spend time, versus something being pushed their way. So, in terms of why it's growing, I think there's a few parties in this growth story.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I've always said this, is that the more your clients and advertisers see this,
Yeah.
and the more producers and broadcasters see it, and it's good, and
Yeah.
it works. They go,
Yeah.
I want that, and so suddenly you know, the more you do good work, the more there will be.
Yeah.
And you know, every time we did another show, we did a gardening show on Channel 4, and they're doing a second series now. And the following week, we had 3 calls from agencies and clients going, "We want one of those. Can we have one of those, please?"
Yeah.
But that's part of the problem and the beauty as well, because it's controlling the volume and the qualitative.
Yeah, and also you don't want to keep doing the same thing. You have to
Absolutely.
keep moving it on as well. But I guess also from the brand's point of view, financially, you can get quite a lot of digital assets out of one show. You know, against an ad spend, it's actually quite a cost-effective
Absolutely.
way of.
Yeah, and I
doing
think
your-
again that's a thing to think about as a producer, is how you can help make that package more appealing, get into their mindset. So what's the stills package? Could we turn this into a physical event? Could we take it into store for you? Sometimes outside of a broadcaster deal, and that can benefit you incrementally as producers as well, but it helps. Some agencies are great at seeing the bigger picture, some aren't, but it really does help show that this is more than just a big expensive badge.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, we'll come on a bit more to what the producers can do around it later. But so, I mean, Simon, you were doing a lot of the examples that are up here are Channel 4 and probably disproportionately, particularly in that kind of factual entertainment space, there's a lot of Channel 4 stuff. Bav, ITV, you've had a really big high-profile one with Cooking with the Stars. What's the kind of ITV approach to it at the moment and how it works for you?
I'll just pick up on Paul's
Yeah.
point about brand interest and how much that's grown over the years. Something we've done from a sponsorship point of view, so I know it's not ad-funded programming, but we have really worked hard in the last decade to take sponsorship from something that was mainly about the sponsorship bumpers that sat around the show to much deeper activation. And I think that is something that has also helped pave the path for the growth in ad-funded programming, because brands have realised how far they can utilise the IP of a show, how they can carry that across different platforms, and then tallied with the growth in social media and the importance of having kind of permission to have a dialogue with the consumer in a slightly different way. The assets that you can create from a sponsorship have allowed that. And sometimes the way we talk about ad-funded programming is it's a really well-activated sponsorship, but that's designed specifically for you as the brand. So it's like a really bespoke version of
You're just
sponsorship.
coming in earlier into the journey.
Yeah,
of the
and
programme.
if the ultimate show doesn't exist, you can create it. You know, Changing Room is a perfect example there. Dulux may have looked around the sponsorship market, not seen exactly the right thing, and thought, actually, let's go and make it. And that's a brilliant example of doing that. From if I flip it back to from us as a broadcaster, you'll have seen earlier this year, actually, we restructured our schedule a little bit in March of this year to focus in very much on the things that drive the live viewing the most. So entertainment, soaps, drama, sport, live daytime content. What that's meant is actually that we have fewer lifestyle factual entertainment slots available. While I agree with Simon that brands are going into ad-funded programming in broader genres, but a lot of these examples will be in that kind of lifestyle entertainment. So especially in home and cookery in particular, they've been really strong genres for many years. And we don't do that much of either of those genres historically anyway, and now we have slightly fewer factual entertainment slots available. So there is a bit of a challenge. While we've got a huge amount of brand interest in ad-funded programming, but arguably less space to accommodate them as per the current schedule for us as a broadcaster. Us as a streamer might change things in the coming years. So when we are looking at shows, and again, to Simon's point, it's entertainment first, it's about the quality of the creative idea first. We're also very much looking for broad audience shows. So we're trying to find formats that will deliver as you know, a mass audience in keeping with kind of ITV's USP. And sometimes when you're looking at ad-funded programming and the direction that a brand is approaching it from, or the brief that they've written, that can feel a little bit niche from an ITV point of view. So something we often have to work with brands is to broaden out their brief, while making sure it still absolutely fulfills their marketing objectives and what they want to achieve from a campaign. I think we have done that.
And obviously Cooking with the Stars is returning. And I guess to your point of, you can't be what you can't see, the more examples in a particular genre, the more perhaps brands start to see that, it doesn't have to just be a factual entertainment. We've got one question from someone in the audience about, is AFP happening across both scripted and unscripted? And I guess this takes us into the question of, genres that do work. And as we've seen from these examples, a lot of it has been factual entertainment, certainly in the UK. I know I've talked with Samantha Glynn from Fremantle. We've all said, we want there to be the big entertainment formats as well. It would be lovely if it could spread across, and Cooking with the Stars is kind of edging more in that, is in more in that area. But then when we talked about brand-funded programming on streaming platforms, particularly in the US, there it seems to be very much more about kind of purpose-led documentary, cost of winning. One example about the Baltimore football team of underprivileged kids, those, and 5B about an AIDS ward. So the kind of brands getting behind a kind of purpose-led documentary. What are you guys seeing in that? I mean, Katie, you've been involved in some along those lines more, haven't you?
So from an agency point of view, and all these guys will be completely familiar with it, but a lot of brands are moving a little bit more into the space of wanting to represent something. So some of the examples we talked about are showcasing their brands, lifestyle programming, but actually brands are sort of recognising how if they feel that something like mental health is important, or gender diversity, or supporting minority groups, that is starting to become more of an important thing. In fact, I remember last night I bought a bar of Tony's chocolate or something, and it was like £3.50, and I opened it all up, and it's all anti-slavery. So you can charge more for a brand because they've got a purpose, a point to them. And in fact, from an Apex Content Ventures point of view, it's an important part of our mission statement is to also support content that is driving all of those purpose-driven points. So supporting diversity, for example, and creating inclusion. So some things we've done is where we have included brands. In one example where we were on Sky Sports, and we had a program around mental health, and we got one of our brands involved in that, and they loved it because they supported mental health as well. So we can do that, and we're definitely seeing that that's another area that's of growth for us. So the brand is less likely to be in the programme, but to your point about building a marketing, Paul was talking about building a marketing campaign around it. This is a great way that they can say, we really care about this particular subject. We want to make a big campaign around that. So that's something that as an agency we're seeing coming through. And certainly from Content Ventures, Apex Content Ventures, we want to do that as well. So
I think also where Scripted's concerned is don't always think about it as the brand funding the whole thing. So storyline integration, I see Sinead from Lime sat over there. Hollyoaks is a great example. We've worked with them at MediaCom in the past around kind of that purpose-driven piece. And how do you integrate into the storyline? And I think, that is, I believe, going to become a much bigger part of the content funding journey, where brands can fund segments or a part of a show or something within a show that contributes towards the funding model. So, yes, there are not as many examples. The lead times are potentially longer, it's more complex. But we also did one way back in the day with Scope, the disability charity, which was short form, admittedly, but really effective in the comedy space. So they do exist, but I think, as you say, these are more common.
And Trigger Happy
TV, I was going to say that.
So, it's... do you know what? Ambition. That's what it's all about, creative ambition. And I believe that, a couple of 5-6 years ago, if somebody had said doing Extreme Everest, which was an extremely risky enterprise anyway.
Stupid idea.
But, Ant Middleton wants to climb Everest. So Barocca said, well, we'll put the money up, we'll put the money up. That's great. He may not have made it. But I mean, at that time, it was like, wow, this is but once it happened, once it was seen, people went, well, you can do even more slightly sort of riskier programming. And I think brands will start to explore other areas as well. So I think it has to be about ambition. I mean, the chap one of the commissioning editors at Channel 4 is now at BBC Studios and runs it, said, I want to work with brands who've got ambition, as I have ambition to make great shows. And I think that's true, and I think that will, the more that we, as I say, the more that we do, the more we will see brands and producers and platforms going, let's partner on this.
I think on that point as well, what's interesting is, understandably, everyone jumps to always the biggest brands, and they always think that they'll have the biggest budgets. But in the instance of Barocca, they're a real challenger brand. They spend very little a year on media, and that investment into Extreme Everest was a small investment, but to them a massive investment. But it enabled them a new route to an audience that punched way above the weight of what their media spend could be. So I guess that's another thing to think about is every agency around town wants to sell an idea to Tesco's or Marks and Spencer's that they might not want to sell onto the Co-op, for example. So there are opportunities there if you think beyond the obvious, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. We often talk about big investment, but think about it from the brand's point of view. Somebody like Barocca, that investment will be really significant to them. And actually, in that sense, they're being just as ambitious as however much money Tesco put into Supermarket Suite. But also, a lot of these brands are more nimble, they're more agile, they're more flexible. They've got local decision makers, which a lot of brands struggle with, international brands. And so there is a real opportunity if you can hit on the right moment with the right brands.
The decision making bit.
Yeah, we'll talk about stakeholders later. But within a brand, if you can narrow down the number of stakeholders, you've got far more chance of success as well. And building the relationship with media agencies, with media owners, to understand the landscape of which brands might be interested beyond the obvious ones is really worthwhile.
And so when you're thinking about, both of you, I guess, the brands that might get behind a show, it's not necessarily about thinking about particularly the brand category, but it's more about their ambition, or if they have something they stand for, or if they are looking to make a particular impact in the market.
And the guys will hopefully back me up on this. AFP tend to come from two different directions. So there's the commissioner-led, so there's commissioner need first, and we try and find a funding partner for that show, or there's the brand brief. Of course, where it's more the kind of commissioner-led need where you have to think a bit differently about what kind of brands you might approach, and that is obviously going to be driven by the show and therefore the categories that feel most appropriate. I think when you get the brand brief in, there you've got a sense of the brand's ambition immediately, but also you get an opportunity to potentially be a bit more abstract about the solution, because you've got a kind of broader perspective from a brand. So I've got a brief on my desk at the moment which is about community. I can't give too much away, but it's about community, and so that gives you quite a lot of scope to play with, and then you're not kind of fixed in an obvious genre from the start.
Okay, talking about those models then, so there are broadly those two approaches, one where it comes from a brand brief, one where it's a commissioner's got a show but they have a funding gap maybe, or they think they could. I mean, in your experience, is there a kind of template for a most successful approach or model, or is it really just...
It's almost like a science.
You might get different.
Each of you.
Yeah. My view is you've got as much chance of success or failure with either.
Right.
Which I know is not necessarily that helpful, but I think it's the reality. Where you start with a brand brief, the brand's got the money and the will and the ambition, but finding a solution that works for that brand isn't always straightforward. Finding a solution that works for the brand and works for the commissioner and the channel isn't always straightforward. Finding the right slot, getting the slot to match the investment.
And the right producer.
Matching the producer, absolutely. So there are just a lot of variables. And equally, if you start from the commission need, yes, you've got the slot guaranteed, but sometimes a brand wants to feel like they've got more of a stake in the show, or in the format or the development of it. So you have to try and create that flexibility, even if you've got a pre-formed idea. So,
make it feel like it's their idea.
Yeah, like Supermarket Suite, for example. That's an established format, but we had to get Tesco to feel like they had an influence on it, even though you've got a kind of set format to the show. So there is risk from either direction. That's my perspective.
I think mine's probably a little bit more commissioner-led. So I was at Sky for a long time, and they had lots of different channels. You've got Sky Arts, Sky Documentary, Sky Sports, Sky Entertainment, Sky, and I think that the commissioning process was so tight and very, very prescriptive. They know exactly what they wanted. So it's quite hard to bring something that was come creative from a brand. It was easier if you have a program they sort of wanted or they liked, or you work closely together. You know what sort of area, and also what producers they like working with. And in terms of how we work now in Apex Content Ventures, we very much work with the broadcasters, so we're supporting the broadcasters to bring them to the content they want. So from our point of view, we're probably more on a commissioning. Let's find what programming you want, and then we'll try and finance it and bring brands into it as well. So it's probably my view on that.
No, I'd agree. And I think a good exercise is look at that board and say, why did that brand get involved in those shows first and foremost? And what, just because I think if you are a producer and you've got a platform really keen to commission your show, really keen, and I know this is the way Paul likes to work, is that you've got a show that the platform really wants, and you go, well, I can make it more affordable for them, or make the show even better by putting some money in, or working in a partnership with a brand who fits really well. And the most obvious fits are the ones that work best for everybody. So for example, there was a show, one of the first really successful shows we made, an ad-funded show, was All Star Driving School. Because it was a driving school, and we just gave them all Suzukis, and then Suzuki would create tons of extra content. It worked beautifully. The cars were an intrinsic part of the show. That kind of obviousness of it works so well, and it's so easy, and it doesn't compromise the editorial. So those are the best, and I think if you're a producer, you should look at your slate and go, now where would brand partners work well here?
Well, we've got a question from the audience, which is, so should a producer take their idea to the channel, brand or agency first? If you are sitting on an idea and you think this is a perfect brand-funded programme.
That's a good question.
$1 million question.
Yeah.
My perspective, and I guess building on the answering the question, is we established a model when I was at Mediacom, and we will take that through to where I am now at UEG, where funding programming is concerned. We're looking for shows that are sort of 80% warm with the commissioner, because we want to know that we, as a buyer on behalf of the brand, I want to know that thing I'm taking is tangible, because there is nothing worse than taking that thing to the client and then that being taken away. So we operated a model whereby we match made. So I would have regular routines with producers to try and understand what it is that they have in development and what's looking warm, and then at that point would introduce that to the brand as sense check. And so my advice would always be you want to make sure that you can get your show onto a platform or a channel or a streamer, and then start to engage that conversation with either brands direct or through agencies, and that's where I've probably done 20 or so of these now, and that's where the most success has come, through that model of, there's been a couple that have worked through Bav's method, but just in terms of scalability, that's how we've done it.
And so how much as an indie can you be having those conversations, or is it more a case of, maintaining your relationship with the commissioner, pitching the ideas to them, and then, if you like, waiting for them to kind of point you in the right direction?
And it's like this marriage in the middle. It's a good example. We talk about changing rooms. See Chris Holdham at the back from Banner J. Myself and him were having a conversation about 2 years ago, and it was just what I class as a routine meeting where we're just talking about the things that they're working on, they have in development, and they were like, I suppose you want a decorating show, do you? We're thinking about bringing back changing rooms, and we've got some interest in it. And we just so happened to be in market, to your point, looking for something for Dulux at that time. And so those matchmaking, marriage opportunities are where a lot of it happens. So yes, you need to be having commissioner conversations, of course, but it's a healthy thing to be building relationships with media agencies as well, and other types of agencies.
But does that help because you are Banijay, or can small, or having routines with, you're presumably not having routines with all of the smaller indies? How, if they're not in a big
I mean,
operation?
a really quick answer on that is the size of your business is irrelevant. I would say if the producer wants to, or if the channel is willing to commission you, then we would be interested in the conversation. Extreme Everest was made by Parable, who at that time were half a dozen people. So it's a really good example of small up to bigger indies, and there's a couple of indies that we've just, in my last sort of 6 months at MediaCom, we worked with projects to get them over the line, a deal with LucasAid, and another one with a really small estate agency brand called On The Market as well. So they're projects that are going to be coming to air. But,
and I know Vicky Kell, who's here, I think she did some interesting work on this last year, and for a report, we were writing a report on it, and I was interested. Her sort of rough tally was that actually by commissions it was 50-50 small in terms of BFP, small indies versus production groups. I think in terms of hours it was more weighted to the big groups, 70-30, but actually in terms of commissions it wasn't the case that it's all, mopped up by the super indies. So I think those opportunities
we work with
are
lots of small indies actually at Channel 4 and large indies. I think it's just a willingness to, and we go back, today it's all about content funding. Brands are one of the, in a new mixed ecology or economy of entertainment, they're now a credible partner, source of finance to help you get a project, a patchwork of funding, help you, perhaps all of it, but and many times, 20%, 30%, 50% of that funding can come from around as a partner. It's a co-project.
And so amongst these sort of examples that we have here, I mean, they are a mix, aren't they, of what's the most, for Channel 4, for example, was it 50-50? How much were full fund and how
Channel
much
4
were...
and I think most people know this in the room, that they have a principle which is ad funding must be 50% of the investment. I don't know how other platforms work. I think I've been doing some work with the Americans recently, just finding out how the American market works. It's quite interesting. They do mixed funding, but actually they prefer brands to pay for all of it, and then pay an access fee as well. But I mean, that's America, and in America it works, But the other thing is blended funding with program finance. That's another way of raising all the finance. Some of it's program finance, some of it's ad-funded programming. So the brand has a marketing asset, and then the agency who they're working with. So, these are. It gets more complicated, but no deal is simple now.
No, and there's no one size fits all. ITV
There's one example on the board which was 50-50, but otherwise the rest are entirely or almost entirely brand funded.
Right.
And that's not to say we're not open-minded about what model we use going forward, but as it's worked so far, that's the route of travel.
Right. Okay.
Do you do program finance and ad-funded blended yet?
Not as of yet.
Yes.
Not as of yet. Because of the way program finance works, because there's a commercial arrangement, essentially the show is still at cost. So if essentially from our point of view, it's a commissioned show. Our business model works best when the show's commissioned and we can sell the sponsorship and monetize it that way. In those examples, that's the model we use.
I suppose if we were program financing a program, then we'd prefer it to be one of our publicists' brands type of thing. So that would be something that would be
rather than bringing in another.
That's better rather than bringing in a different brand. So.
Just to go back to that question about who to speak to first, and that again there is no straight answer. My advice though is, if as soon as ad funding is part of the conversation on a show, whether that's brand-led, agency-led, commission-led, whatever it might be, try and bring all parties together as early as possible in the process, because that'll enhance your chances of success quite significantly.
Yes, and interestingly, when I was interviewing lots of the Americans for the report on brand funded on streaming platforms, it was very much the case that all of the kind of big guys who'd done things like Dads and 5B, it was don't go in the commercial door, Go in the editorial door, don't even mention brand funding, say we've got this project from this director, it's going to be huge. Oh, and by the way, we might have a brand who might pay for some of it, rather than going in through the commercial door, and because then you...
I think it's fair to say that simply having a brand attached to a format doesn't necessarily increase its chances.
No, might diminish its chances? Or
it depends on,
who you're talking
to a degree, who you're talking to, and that commissioner's experience and understanding about funded programs.
It depends on the idea. It's a great idea.
It is relationships.
It can help.
Yeah.
It's about the more relationships and collaboration you have, then the more that's the sort of like matchmaking and then working together. That's key.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no point in trying to force something through funding.
Just because it's got...
Again, as a buyer, in 6 months, you're the one who's got the difficult conversation in your hands about why it's not worked.
Yeah.
You do one bad one, you don't do them again. So it has to be authentically right.
Yeah.
And just while we're sort of talking about that, I think on the funding splits and stuff like that, don't underestimate the ability and the role the brand plays in, as a producer, you achieving a repeat series because of the amount of money that they invest into the promotion of the series. So they are driving eyeballs to this. There is absolutely no doubt. And I'm very sort of aware of the success of Change Rooms was partly driven by Dulux and the amount of promotion that they drove. And I'm sure in some cases with Marks and Spencer's what they did as well. So I think my point being is that it's not always critical in my mind that the brand funds all the programme if the bigger marketing funding pot enables you to do other things with it.
Right, so it's still in their interest.
There is so much... there's so much demand for marketing promotion for shows. So internally, commissioners are debating which shows get promoted. So when you've got an ad-funded show, it's not necessarily the case that it'll get the same proportion of promotion that the brand would like it to. So a brand's ability, as Paul says, to kind of celebrate it through...
See the bigger picture,
its platform, see the opportunity to help promote it, to drive audience is totally
That's
great.
really important.
It really helps.
Yeah, and I mean, we have got some great examples now, luckily, of shows that are coming back for second series. So Cooking with the Stars, Great Garden Revolution, Changing Rooms. So that's a sort of signifier that in the last few years, these are good shows that are pleasing everybody and so are coming back. But I guess one of the problems is that it's hard enough getting through the eye of a needle of a commissioner who still wants your show, hasn't moved and gone to another channel. But then when you've also got the brand and the chief marketing officers left and there's a new set of priorities for this year and, do we still want to fund this show? I suppose it brings us on to the next question of the stakeholders, but there are a lot of people to keep happy and to hit their targets, which may all be slightly different. How does one manage that, particularly if you're the producer stuck in the middle?
So is the producer stuck in the middle, or are we all stuck in some kind of...
Everyone thinks they're in the middle.
So I talk about there are usually 5 stakeholders on an ad-funded programme, which is kind of producer, commissioner, commercial team, media or creative agency, and then the client. Roughly, I think that's about right. If you were simply getting a show commissioned as a producer, you would have you and the commissioner, and if it was a commission that we were looking for a sponsor, you'd have the other 3 in the mix rather than 5. So instantly, you've just got a load more variables, and for all of us and everybody in that mix, there's a need for greater collaboration, understanding that there are more points of view, more opinions, more time taken up. But if you rely on the specialists within that and you all kind of empathise with each other and walk in each other's shoes a little bit, so I can't remember whether it was Simon or Paul made the point earlier about producer thinking about something from a marketeer's point of view, and equally from a brand's perspective thinking about what trust in the producer to make the best show, trust in the commissioner to understand what works on that network. You have to have that trust and underandstanding in order for an ad fund to work because of the additional number of stakeholders.
I think it's having a really good account management, because a brand will be asking for things that are first potentially compromising editorially, and secondly they're just not allowed. So you have to be really honest, upfront, collaborative, working together, trusting. And yeah, the best projects I've had was like 3 people: the client, the producer, and me was representing the kind of the whole of the TV bit, and that was just brilliant because everyone's looking after their separate parts, and we all had a very close network group, and it worked really well. So.
So is that about, I mean, we've got a question about what skill sets does a producer need to work with brands? Is it about a skill set? Is it about a mindset? Is it about bringing in someone experienced, someone who can help navigate you through it, especially if you're a smaller producer? What?
Not doing myself out of a job here.
Simon.
Because I'm the consultant, but it's about mindset. The ad world is a service industry. I worked in advertising, I used to make TV commercials. And if the client said, I want that shot longer, you go, absolutely, how much longer? In television, effectively, there are 2 clients. There's the audience, that's the biggest client, actually.
Yeah.
You've got to make a program that your client, the audience, wants to watch. And the brand must understand that when they start this journey with you as a producer.
Yeah.
And you have got to collaborate. As a producer, you've got to be open-minded and understand where they're coming from, but also your other client, which is your platform, effectively, really. Everybody's got to have the right mindset, be open-minded, be prepared to collaborate. And probably in many cases, and I've had some shocking experiences over the years with clients, a couple.
Not any Paul's clients.
Not with Paul. Paul's the best client. But no, I'm not. Agencies sometimes will jump to the defence of their client, go, yeah, they want this and they want this. You go, but you're going to ruin the programme.
Yeah.
You just understand.
But that's all part of where agencies have become better at this, and they've understood it. And I think, and that 10 years ago they wanted to buy you into a slot. Now they understand it.
My point is, we're all getting better at this. Everybody's getting better at it. The producers are. They're understanding it. And as they get better, we'll do more of it, and it'll be a much smoother process. I mean, I'm still working on a few projects, and I'm working with producers who really get it now.
Does it take, someone said when I was interviewing for one of the reports we did, that just expect don't underestimate the resource needed, because it is double the amount of conversations and meetings to have, but also the kind of polish. Do I have to make my pitch now like a pitch for an ad, or what? Is there a lot more kind of?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think just to colour in the last question and this one, I think the thing about resource, I think you need a point person. You need someone who becomes that regular point of contact. In all the best examples, we've collaborated in terms of getting in a room early, and that's everybody from the commissioner, the agency person, the brand person, and the producer. Building that relationship early is so key to navigating the turbulence. And there will be turbulence at some point in this flight, without a doubt. And, changing rooms was a classic example of trying to film that right in the middle of COVID, where, the client, and Chris at the back will back me up, has been absolutely fantastic because they've understood the context. And that was only possible due to the relationship that we built with them collectively. They trusted the producer, they trusted their agency, they trusted the voice of the commissioner. So that is absolutely key. I don't think you need realms and realms of people as a producer, but you do need a point contact, and that point contact needs to be empathetic to the situation and all parties. And I think that's a key word in trying to understand and be empathetic to the bigger picture. I think in terms of decks and polished, no. Honestly, I think...
It's mindset. It's definitely not. It's not
an
skill
idea
set.
and a match.
Do what you're good at, which is pitching.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, Simon, is we as the buyers don't need the treatment that you would be pitching to the broadcaster necessarily. What we need is the accelerator pitch, which is the summary of the idea, the distribution platforms, the talent, potentially their reach, what are the deliverables and the investment. You can tell that in 6 slides. There's another deck that lives somewhere else.
Or what happens in episode 3.
I mean, in very few occasions have I sat with any brand who said, well, out of part 1, what's the narrative arc of that? Because they don't know, and they don't really care. They might care about where their brand plays, but that's another thing. So
I would totally agree that what's of value and what's worth thinking about as a producer is the additional assets that you can create and supply to a brand, and helping them understand that it's not just a show, but it's a campaign. If you can get into that mindset early, that definitely helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally. I mean, again, the exercise, looking at that and going, how could they activate it? So when you are talking to the client, say, but you could, to Paul's point, you could make an event, you could do this, and the clients, that's when their kind of eyes spark, because they know that the show does one job for them, but it's what other jobs can.
And producers are increasingly used to having to generate, digital assets for all sorts of things anyway. So I mean, that's already a big job on top of any.
To answer the question again about resource, that is one thing to try and understand early, because there'll be a potential deliverable issue there if further down the line this is, we thought we were getting X amount of clips and you've not budgeted for that in the edit. So I think it's good to understand that early on, but it also does open up potentially some incremental revenue opportunities for producers in terms of additional stuff that's outside of what you promised them to do.
On the M&S example, South Shore, the producer, they created an additional piece of content for M&S called Extra Helpings with two kind of YouTube influencer chefs, William Cliney, and that's came out of an incremental pot of money, incremental brief from M&S. So Paul's absolutely right. If you get in that headspace early, there might be some additional money that you can access as well.
And talent. We haven't talked about talent, but talent absolutely can do. Really turbocharge a campaign. And that's right. It's a campaign. That's how you sell it to an advertiser.
Talent is really appealing to brands.
But then who manages that relationship? Is it still the producer trying to protect the talent from?
Well, there's two different things. There's what happens in the show and the promotion of the show, which ideally the producer would handle that part. And then there's the part around, well, does the brand want to contract the expert or the talent to do bespoke content on their channels, which the agency loves because that's incremental to us, because that's effectively talent ambassadorial, influencer marketing, that kind of thing. So, the other part of this is thinking about what are the commercial touch points for the middle person, the agency in the middle, because they're also they're incentivized to try and do as much as they can as well. So.
And then to add a whole other layer of complications, so then what about if you have a format that as a producer you're hoping travels internationally, as most producers do? How often is it the case that the brand then wants to stay with the show internationally? Is that something you should be aiming for, or is it just too much of a headache?
I mean, we can help. So we can help if a programme is potentially in one territory and we've been involved in that somehow. We can help producers with our relationships because we're a global brand, so we have markets all over the world, so we can help with that relationship. So it can work in that way potentially. So that's one way that we can do it. But I think generally speaking, I don't know, you can guys probably answer this, but I'd say mainly we work in the market. I don't know if you'd agree.
We've done, All-Star Driving School is running in 5-6 markets now. And in each market, actually the brand wanted to be, I'm sure you'll come on to rights and that sort of area in a minute, but the brand didn't want to be a partner in those other markets, but it had an option to. But other brands did, so other car brands, so they couldn't have a holdback. So, I think it's in Kia in Poland is funding the show. And so, yes, I mean, the golden kind of AFP opportunity is when you create a format and it travels internationally. And I mean, there are a few of those are shows that, in format sense, will have traveled or will travel. I think the new IKEA show is for something that would travel.
Morocco certainly did. Land Rover Everest has been sold in quite a few territories. Skoda Tour de Celeb sold in a few. Change Rooms is in a few more at the moment. It really does depend on local marketing agendas.
With the same brand attached each time.
In that instance. I always found it quite challenging, if I'm honest, at MediaCom in terms of trying to connect those dots. In my newer role at UEG, the more global opportunities seem more prevalent. They seem to be carrying through across multiple markets. It depends on the stakeholders, their agility, the size of the brands, whether the show travels.
And also if the
aspiration.
producer is, of a sufficient size to be that's the main
But it's
key
definitely,
priority
it
for
should
them.
be considered because it can open doors. You can get commissions in other markets that you'd never have got because you've got a brand partner.
Yeah.
In
And
Australia.
agencies can make, because they're often, we have clients that are in every single territory, so we can we can try and help it travel. So, that can really be good.
And so I guess that does bring us on to the question of rights. How much are brands interested in having a piece of that international format pie or not?
It's not their first question, put it that way. It's more about their current need state, which is often quite narrow, if I'm honest, about how do I raise brand awareness or how do I move this campaign on? And they're not, in my experience, it's not first on their agenda. It can be a nice to have. In many cases, it's not something that we negotiate on their behalf because we understand that particular production might be very tight on margin, it might be a small budget. There's various parts to the algorithm, I would say, but it's not something we've done I've done a huge amount of. In that instance, probably more Katie, I would say.
I've been asked by brands a little bit, but I don't think they even understand particularly the revenue model. So you can, I think it's not really.
It's also not worth anything until it's worth something. And it's a complicated
But then
one
do
to
they ever
explain.
come back afterwards and go, hang on a second, this is our show, why are we not?
Unless they're someone very savvy and they kind of understand that there's enough, but from my experience, that's unlikely.
Well, we've had a couple of brands who, or marketeers who have been savvy enough, but also ambitious enough because they believe in their format so much they couldn't possibly envisage it not travelling around the world and selling in hundreds of territories. So,
I mean,
Bit naivety.
The Pepsi chart show was a great example because that was an ad-funded show in about 20 markets.
Right, yeah.
And nobody's quite replicated that. But I think it will happen. It will happen.
I always remember Gillette World of Sport.
And Gillette World of Sport, absolutely. Again, in a magazine format.
I think you'll see it happening with the streamers more, where they don't get a bumper or they don't get an accreditation, but for funding it in return they get a share of the upside potentially. So it could be something along those lines, but and I'm sure deals like that are being done already.
People don't talk about them, actually. That's the thing. But they are being done.
Right,
sure,
yeah, okay. So I guess the other question, we're all evangelising about brand-funded programming, but how much is enough? I mean, how much do we want brand-funded programming on both, our main linear channels and elsewhere? Is there a limit?
If it's done well, there is still a limit, absolutely. I mean, you can't have a platform that doesn't have a mixed ecology of finance. And, you've got to make money. And in many ways, if you're a platform, it's not making you any money unless you're getting your advertising revenue from it, from the spots. So there is a limit, absolutely. I mean, I think at Channel 4 we found there was a limit that we could handle.
And was that a conscious limit, or was it just a resource we can't manage?
Both, really.
Right.
But also, I mean, the finance ecology of a platform has got to say, okay, some of the content, if it's good enough, it saves us some money on our commissioning and our production expenditure. It saves us some money, but it's got to be good enough, and we'll do it. But you can only do so much because...
If the brands all suddenly go, well, no, not enough people are watching our ads, we just want to fund programmes now directly.
This links to a point Paul made earlier. So I think there's a limit on how much straightforward brand funds a show to exist can happen. But what we're seeing more and more of is brands integrating into shows in different ways, and that is still a form of brand funding. Yeah. So this week I think we've got going live Heineken Zero product placing in our soaps on Corrie and Emmerdale with a beer pump. That is feels really different and kind of moving things on in the product placement space. So I think you'll see more and more of that, and that solves the conundrum about a cut through in advertising.
I personally have always been worried about too much, and this is someone who's trying to sell it. I feel that the market could become too flooded. I think that's where the commissioner voice is so key, and that we don't try and push too hard, and authentically it needs to be a thing that a channel or a platform wants. I think that may sound quite depressing to a producer. What I would say is, don't waste your development slate. Think about other ways to get those ideas out there. Can they be social entertainment formats? I know this is about linear, but actually, we at UEG we're getting so much more demand for brands who want to play in social entertainment, and often they're talent-led. So I think reversioning your ideas to work across different platforms means that you're sweating your development slate as well. And so think about why that's of interest, and potentially, that's why those agency relationships are key as well.
I think it comes back to the question about, is it commissioner-led? And if it continues to be driven by the audience and what they want to watch, then that people are watching it for the right content, then you're in a good space.
Yeah.
And we are highly regulated in terms of how much prominence there can be. So it's okay, but I think people might switch off if the content itself drops in quality because a brand is dictating it, then that's a danger.
Yeah.
But if commissioning is still driving and they understand the audience, then I think then we're okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, just before we finish then, I mean, it was a question that we had from the audience, but I guess it is the key question for any producer here. If a producer is wanting to get into brand-funded content and perhaps hasn't done it before, what piece of advice would you give them? Where should they start, and what should they think about?
For us, we have a team at Publicis who specialise in partnerships and branded content, so making relationships with those guys. They have access to all of the brands in the Publicis stable, so they can talk to you about what's available. So that would be sort of working through the agencies, essentially.
But they should come to you perhaps with an idea in the first instance.
With a slate of ideas, to Paul's point, there's lots of brands, and it's matchmaking. It's a matchmaking process.
The most irritating conversation is for a producer to come in, or a media owner, or a publisher of any kind, and sit you down. They've asked for a meeting. They sit you down and go, right, what briefs have you got? And I'm like, sorry? And it's actually, I'm interested in what you're making, what you've got, what's interesting, what you think audiences are interested in. And, we're here to match that to brands. So I think the answer to the question is those conversations are good. You should try and have some of those conversations with the bigger media agencies, the content agencies, potentially even the creative agencies. You may even want to go brand direct.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's the way the market's changing, and I think that it is about what opportunities are there, because these are the things we're making, and they have potential for a brand partner. Because the briefs are, getting the briefs is hard. It's better to share what you've got. I think we moved to that at Channel 4, actually. We started releasing a slate of, these are the shows we'd like to make.
Sometimes an idea generates a brief. So X-producer might come in and we float X idea, but they go, that's not quite right. But then what that stimulates is a brief. And then Bav gets his brief. And then everyone's happy. So the whole system's working.
Bav needs a brief.
The M&S thing came from a long-standing relationship with M&S. They were sponsoring Britain's Got Talent. They created an ad campaign with us, and so it was quite an organic process. So there's no. So I'll go back to the point at the start. There's no straight answer to that. My two bits of advice would be, if ad-funded programming is something you want to explore, get the right people around the table as quickly as possible. And the other thing is to get into the mindset of campaign rather than program, and that because then you're thinking about it from the brand's point of view as well.
Two very good pieces of advice.
Thanks. Okay, well, on those pieces of advice, we will end. Thank you very much to everybody on the panel. I hope that's been useful. Thank you.
Well, that's about it for this week's show. Thanks to all of our panellists for sharing their insights. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers and recorded in London. Until next week's show, as always, stay safe.